Good afternoon, teachers. Today we're going to go over a brief lesson plan that comes from the AP Macro 5th unit, which is the unit on the financial sector. So today we're going to go over something a lot of students have some significant difficulty with, which is covering the concept of multiple deposit expansion. So today's big lesson is trying to answer the essential question, how do banks and thrifts create money? Now, as I found out the hard way many, many times, it's of the utmost importance that this lesson come after your introduction to the banking system, because students need to have a general understanding of what a bank and a thrift is and how they operate with regards to loans and charging interest and that type of thing, before this particular lesson will make any sense at all to them. So the big question, how do banks and thrifts create money? We're going to attempt to answer this question in 3 parts. So the first part, we're going to talk about what fractional reserve banking is and why that plays a role in multiple deposit expansion. The second one, we're going to answer the question, what is money? And then this will lead us to our final discussion of how banks and thrifts create money without actually printing new currency. So stick with me on this lesson, and we're going to do a brief run through on all of this. So part 1 of answering the question of how do banks and thrifts create money involves having an understanding of what fractional reserve banking is. Hopefully at this point you've already discussed different types of currency systems with them, so the students are familiar with the concept of fiat currency. Pretty much all fiat currency systems operate on fractional reserve banking. And what this means is when you put a deposit into your bank, the bank doesn't just hold on to your money. So if I deposit $500 into my bank account, there isn't a box with my name on it in the bank vault that they put it in, but rather the bank is going to bring in this money. They're going to give me something back in the form of checkable deposits, and then they're going to take that cash and they're going to lend it out to somebody else in the form of loans. So the bank isn't allowed to lend out every single dollar that I deposit, however, because that could lead to insolvency. So banks are required to hold on to a certain percentage of all of their checkable deposits as set by the reserve requirement, and they are allowed to lend out the rest. And so this system, where banks bring in deposits, loan out most of the money, and hold on to a fraction of it, is what's called fractional reserve banking. And understanding the concept of fractional reserve banking is key to understanding multiple deposit expansion, because multiple deposit expansion can't happen under any system that doesn't use fractional reserves. So, long story short, fractional reserve banking requires banks to only hold a percentage, a relatively small percentage of total deposits in reserve, and they can lend out the rest. Having fractional reserves is what leads to banks and thrifts being able to create money. The second big question we're going to work on here is what is money? And I want to break this up into 2 kind of little mini lessons here, both of which I think are relatively easy to understand. So the big place where we're headed with the question, what is money, is we want the kids to understand that currency in circulation, so their dollars and their paper and their coins, and checkable deposits in the bank, which are just effectively numbers on a computer screen, we want the kids to leave this lesson understanding that paper money and digital money on a computer screen in the form of checkable deposits are equally good money. They are both money and they are both equally money. It's not like one is real money and the other isn't. I can go to Target and I can spend cash. I can go to Target and I can spend imaginary numbers from my bank account by swiping my debit card. Either way it's money. Either way I can make purchases of goods and services. Target doesn't really care which of those 2 forms of money that I choose to use. So understanding the basic concept that checkable deposits are every bit as much money as paper currency or coins is kind of where we're headed with this question, because the kids need to wrap their heads around that concept before we can actually talk about multiple deposit expansion. And in my experience, kids tend to be relatively resistant to this particular idea, the idea that paper money is just a social and economic fabrication, just like checkable deposits and numbers on a computer screen are. They tend to have some resistance to that. So you may want to spend some time kind of talking them through it. So the way that I like to talk them through it is we first talk about like what are the requirements for something to be considered money. And then we go about figuring out how the Federal Reserve actually calculates the money supply, which is going to help us to understand multiple deposit expansion. So there's basically 4 requirements for something to be money. It has to be, number 1, generally acceptable in exchange for goods and services, meaning that you can't come up with your own money if nobody else believes in it. Everybody has to agree that this thing is money in order for it to be money. Rule number 2 is something that has to be durable. So money has to be something that is going to last for years and years and years and that you can save in. This is why I tell the kids, for example, you can't really use chickens as money. I can't save for retirement in chickens because those chickens will not still be good 40 or 50 years down the line. So it has to be a durable resource, something that's going to maintain its value, maintain its form, won't go bad for a very long time. Requirement number 3, money has to be portable, meaning that this money has to be something you can reasonably be expected to walk around with. This is why, my car isn't money. It's just not portable. I can't walk around and take my car into Target and break off pieces of it to pay for groceries or something like that. And last but not least, money has to be scarce. It can't be something that's very plentiful throughout the landscape, or it's not going to be worth anything. So we need either real scarcity when it comes to something like commodity money. So if I'm using gold, gold is a relatively scarce resource just on planet Earth in general, or it has to have some form of enforced scarcity, like our fiat currency system is going to have. There's only so many dollars out there because the government is the one controlling the overall money supply. So as long as something meets these 4 requirements, it can be used as money. If it's generally acceptable, if it's durable, if it's portable, and if it is scarce, it can be money. And checkable deposits check off all 4 of those boxes just as well as paper money does, just as well as gold does, or any other form of money. So from going to this point, we need to then understand how the Fed goes about actually calculating the money supply. And for the purposes of this, we're really only interested in M1 money because that's the one that's going to come up most often on the AP exam. So the kids need to understand that M1 money is equal to currency in circulation plus checkable deposits plus traveler's checks. For the most part, I'm going to pretty much ignore traveler's checks. Those are, for the most part, a thing of the past. So really, if the kids know that M1 is equal to currency plus checkable deposits, that's really the piece of information they need to understand multiple deposit expansion. So now that we have the basics of money and the monetary system down, we can now go to answering the essential question, how do banks and thrifts create money? In order to do this, I've always found for the kids that explaining to them how banks and thrifts create money doesn't really make any sense without some kind of simulation. So for this particular lesson, I usually come around with like some dollar bills or some Monopoly money or something, and a sticky note, and I'll use the sticky notes and I'll hand them out to the kids to represent checkable deposits, and I'll have them have the Monopoly money as cash to represent currency in circulation. I found that if you just explain it without actually having the kids money change hands and checkable deposits change hands and kids get up and walk around, that it tends to not really stick and doesn't make anywhere near as much sense. So when you go through this, I highly recommend you go through kind of the scenario I'm about to walk you through, but do it physically with something tangible the kids can actually see, because I think it's going to help them to understand the concept. So in order to understand how banks and thrifts create money, we're going to create a scenario here where we're going to pretend that we have an economy that only has $500 total in currency. At the beginning of our scenario, that currency is going to be in the hands of a gentleman named Bill. So Bill is currently sitting around in scenario A with $500 in cash. Given that M1 money is currency in circulation plus checkable deposits, that means that this economy has $500 in currency in circulation because it's in Bill's hands, and $0 in checkable deposits, giving us a total value of M1 of $500. Because people don't like to hold a lot of cash on hand for security reasons and all sorts of other reasons as well, in scenario B, Bill is now going to take his $500 in cash and deposit it into the bank. The action of depositing the currency into the bank is going to create $0 of currency in circulation now, because money sitting in bank vaults is not in circulation. But in return for his $500 in currency, the bank is going to give Bill $500 in checkable deposits, which is great for Bill because checkable deposits are money as well. So he hasn't really lost anything. He's turned one form of money into a different and frankly more convenient and more secure form of money. So Bill can go to the store and he can swipe his debit card and spend his checkable deposits just as easily, if not easier, than his $500 in currency. So we now, at scenario B, have $0 in currency in circulation and $500 in checkable deposits, giving us a value of M1 of still $500. So nothing has actually changed. The money supply is going to expand when Bill's bank actually takes the currency that Bill had and loans it out. So in this scenario, in scenario C, we're going to say that Bill's bank then takes the money that Bill had deposited and is going to create a loan. So Bill's going to loan $450 of the $500 to Ted, and now Ted is walking around with $450 in currency. Bill is walking around with $500 in checkable deposits, and this now gives us a money supply of $950. So this simple act of Bill's bank taking his deposit and loaning the money out to Ted has now increased the money supply by $450, which is almost double the money supply. This is not the only stop in this process, right? This process is essentially going to repeat itself because Ted's going to go and spend the money at Walmart. Walmart's going to deposit the money into their bank account, and Walmart's bank is then going to make a loan with that money, and so forth and so on. So, long story short, banks and thrifts create new money, but they create new money not in the form of currency, but in the form of checkable deposits. And the action that they take that creates new checkable deposits is when they issue loans. So the act of a bank taking in a deposit and issuing a loan creates new money. And the concept the kids have to understand is that new money, even though it's in the form of checkable deposits, it doesn't have a paper equivalent backing it up, but it is every bit as good as paper money is. And so by the time this is done, we might end up with $1,200 or $1,300 or $1,400 in the money supply, even though there's only $500 in physical paper in the whole economy. And this is perfectly okay, and this is one of the functions, and frankly, one of the reasons why we have a fiat currency system. It allows banks to create money in addition to the government creating currency. So banks create checkable deposits. They create checkable deposits when they issue loans, and that is how banks and thrifts create money.